Step into the world of ancient Rome, a place where marriage wasn't about love, romance, or two hearts making a promise. It was about power, about family legacy, about securing alliances that could shape politics and strengthen influence. For the Romans, tying the knot wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale, it was more like signing a legal contract. Contract between families, not individuals. And inside that contract, one truth stood out: loyalty in the romantic sense wasn't really expected. In fact, Roman husbands weren't just allowed to be unfaithful, they were expected to. Affairs were common, often public, and rarely scandalous. A man could have short-lived flings or long-term companions outside his marriage, and society hardly blinked. Many of these lovers were courteous and celebrated for their wit, charm, and companionship, though never considered marriage material. But here's the twist: Roman men didn't stop at relationships with women. Men in ancient Rome also openly formed romantic and sexual relationships with other men, and this wasn't something whispered about in secret. It was normalized, even respected. There was no shame in it, no stigma, and definitely no modern-style labels like gay or straight. For the Romans, what mattered wasn't who you were with, but the balance of power inside the relationship. See, Roman society was obsessed with dominance and control. Relationships, whether with women or with men, were judged by their structure, not their gender dynamic. In a typical man-woman pairing, the husband was seen as the dominant force, the protector, the decision-maker. The active role, the wife, she was expected to be passive, submissive, and supportive. This same lens applied to male-male relationships. The issue wasn't to men being together, it was which role each one played. The older, more powerful partner who took the active role maintained his masculine reputation, but the man who played the passive, receptive role, especially if he was an adulterous, criticism, because that position was associated with femininity and submission. There were exceptions, though. If the passive partner was much younger, say a teenager, the relationship was often viewed as acceptable, even admirable. In fact, Romans borrowed a custom from the Greeks called pederasty. This was a structured relationship where an older man, called the Eures, took on a mentorship role with a younger partner, the Eromenos. It wasn't always just about intimacy. It was also about guidance, education, and social advancement. The older man offered wisdom, protection, and influence, while the younger partner gained status and an entry point into Rome's political and social elite. In this way, relationships weren't just personal, they were part of the machinery of Roman society itself. But as with all societies, reality didn't always fit neatly into the rules. Even the most powerful men sometimes broke, bent, or tried to fight these expectations. And when they did, the gossip could be relentless. Take Julius Caesar, for example, one of Rome's most iconic leaders. A brilliant general, and a man whose ambition changed the course of history. In public, Caesar embodied strength and dominance, but behind closed doors, rumors swirled that in his relationships with men, he sometimes played the submissive role. To the Roman mind, this was baffling. How could a man so commanding in politics and war possibly take on the role they considered feminine in private? These whispers turned into political weapons. Opponents mocked him in the Senate, spread gossip in the streets, and used scandalous cartoons to undermine his image. For Romans, control and dominance weren't just about ruling an empire, they were about how you carried yourself in every aspect of life, even in intimacy. And then there was Emperor Hadrian, a man who completely rewrote the rules of love. Officially, he was married because every emperor had to be, but his marriage was strictly political, cold and detached. His real devotion was reserved for a young man named Antinous. Hadrian didn't just love Antinous, he adored him. He gave him the finest education, traveled with him across the empire, and treated him as a companion in both statecraft and daily life. Their bond was so deep that when tragedy struck, it shook the empire. While journeying through Egypt, Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile River. No one knows exactly how it happened. Some said it was an accident, others believed it was ritual sacrifice. But what followed stunned the Roman world. Hadrian, consumed by grief, immortalized Antinous. He built an entire city near the site of his death, naming it Antinopolis. He had Antinous' body mummified and brought back to Rome, an extraordinary act at the time. He commissioned coins stamped with his face, statues carved in his likeness, and most astonishingly, declared him a god. This was almost unheard of. Very few mortals were ever elevated to divine status in Rome, and yet Antinous was worshipped across the empire. Shrines rose in his honor, rituals were performed, and his image lived on in art, coinage, and culture. Their love story wasn't just personal, it became legendary. And that's only the beginning. Because when it comes to Roman emperors and their relationships, Hadrian was far from the only one to stir scandal, rewrite norms, and leave behind a legacy tangled in power, passion, and politics. If Hadrian's love story with Antinous showed us how far devotion could go in Rome, Emperor Nero's relationships revealed something entirely different: how passion could turn into spectacle, scandal, and sometimes cruelty. And like most emperors who tried to keep their same-sex relationships behind palace walls, Nero flaunted his. He didn't just keep lovers, he married them, and not quietly either. One of the most shocking examples was his marriage to a former slave named Pythagoras. But here's the twist: Nero didn't play the role of the groom. Instead, he dressed as the bride. He wore a veil, walked through the ceremony in full bridal attire, and publicly took on the submissive role that Roman society considered feminine. For Rome, this was explosive. An emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was the embodiment of masculine power, and seeing him step into a role associated with submission and femininity shattered expectations. The city was stunned. But Nero didn't stop there. Later, he married another young man named Sporus. This time, however, he reversed the performance, playing the masculine role himself. Rome watched in disbelief as their emperor staged not one, but two same-sex weddings. The message was clear, even in matters of love. Nero refused to play by the rules, yet behind the spectacle was something darker. The relationship with Sporus became one of the most disturbing chapters of Nero's personal life, in an effort to make the union appear more like a traditional husband and wife pairing. Nero went to horrifying lengths. He had Sporus castrated, stripping the young man of his identity, all to maintain the illusion of a bride. It was a cruel reminder of how deeply Roman society tied gender roles to power. Nero's decision wasn't just about intimacy, it was about control, dominance, and preserving his image, no matter the cost. Ancient historians describe him as manipulative and abusive in his relationships, twisting love into something closer to performance and possession. And as if that wasn't scandalous enough, Nero's reputation carried an even darker rumor, one that has haunted his legacy for centuries. Some ancient sources claim that Nero had an incestuous relationship with his own mother, Agrippina the Younger. Writers like Suetonius and Tacitus mention the possibility, though with varying levels of certainty. According to these accounts, Agrippina may have used intimacy as a way to keep her son under her influence after he rose to power. Whether true or not, the rumor alone was enough to devastate Nero's reputation. In Rome, where reputation was as valuable as gold, scandal was a political weapon. If you wanted to destroy someone's credibility, you didn't just challenge their politics, you attacked their private life. And for an emperor, accusations of incest weren't just shocking. They were career-ending slander. Most modern historians believe the claim was likely exaggerated, or outright false, a vicious attempt by rivals to tarnish Nero's name. But the damage was permanent. Even today, when people hear Nero's name, whispers of that rumor echo through history. And Nero wasn't the only emperor whose private life became public scandal. Take Emperor Tiberius, Rome's second emperor after Augustus. Tiberius began his reign with dignity and competence. But in his later years, he retreated from Rome's spotlight. He moved to the island of Capri, building lavish villas where he lived in relative isolation. What happened on Capri became the stuff of legend, and not in a good way. Ancient writers painted shocking pictures of Tiberius's private life, claiming he surrounded himself with young attendants for purposes that went far beyond simple companionship. Some sources accused him of indulging in debauchery, using his secluded villas as playgrounds for excess. But here's the tricky part. We may never know how much of this was true. Roman historians were notorious for exaggerating the vices of unpopular rulers. The more distant and reclusive Tiberius became, the easier it was to cast him as corrupt and decadent. For his enemies, these stories weren't about truth, they were about shaping legacy. Still, the rumors stuck, and for centuries, Tiberius's name has been shadowed by suspicion. Whether fair or not, it shows just how dangerous isolation and secrecy could be for a Roman emperor. When you stepped away from the public eye, people filled the silence with scandal. By now, one thing is clear in ancient Rome: love and sex were never just private matters. They were political, symbolic, and deeply tied to ideas of dominance and control. For emperors, especially, personal choices carried enormous weight. Who they loved, how they loved, and even the roles they played became reflections of their power or challenges to it. And while figures like Hadrian and Antinous showed us a softer, almost romantic side of Roman passion, Nero and Tiberius revealed its darker extreme spectacles that blurred the line between desire and domination. But there's one more layer to this story, because for the Romans, relationships, whether scandalous or celebrated, weren't just about personal fulfillment. They were also about politics. Every whisper of gossip, every shocking rumor, every public act of devotion or cruelty shaped the way emperors were remembered. In Rome, image was everything. And when your image cracked, even just a little, it could haunt you for generations. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern: love, marriage, and relationships in Rome weren't private affairs. They were public theater. Every emperor, every senator, every powerful family knew that intimacy wasn't just about desire. It was a statement. It could strengthen alliances, destroy reputations, or even shake an empire. Take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Roman society never separated sex, marriage, and politics. They were woven together in a web of power and control. Who you married wasn't about love, it was about strategy. Who you slept with wasn't about personal identity, it was about dominance and performance. And for the rulers of Rome, their personal choices were magnified across the empire. We've seen how Julius Caesar's rumored submissive role in private relationships was turned into a weapon by his political rivals. How Hadrian's devotion to Antinous became one of the most famous love stories in history, reshaping the cultural landscape of the empire. How Nero's marriages to men shocked the public, blurring the line between passion and performance, while his cruelty left scars on those closest to him. And how Tiberius's isolation on Capri turned into a canvas for rumors that painted him as a corrupt recluse. Each of these stories reminds us of something essential. In Rome, power wasn't only about armies, conquests, or politics. It was also about image. And nothing revealed a person's image more than their relationships. But here's the deeper truth: Romans didn't think about identity the way we do today. They didn't label people as straight or gay. They didn't divide relationships into categories based on gender. Instead, they judged them through the lens of dominance. Who was in control? Who played the active role? Who submitted? These questions mattered far more than the gender of the people involved. That's why a man could have a wife, lovers, courtesans, and male companions, and no one would accuse him of being immoral so long as he stayed in the dominant role. But the moment a grown man stepped into the passive position, the whispers began to Romanize. That wasn't about sexuality, it was about losing masculinity. This obsession with dominance stretched beyond the bedroom. It was embedded in Roman culture itself. Politics, military leadership, even family life all revolved around hierarchies of control. To be Roman was to command, not to submit. And intimacy became another stage where that cultural script played out. Yet, despite all these rigid expectations, human emotion always found ways to break through. Hadrian's grief over Antinous wasn't political, it was raw, aching love. The gossip around Caesar's rumored submissiveness showed how fragile even the strongest reputations could be. Nero's twisted performances blurred the boundary between passion and cruelty. And Tiberius's withdrawal reminded everyone how power, when left unchecked, could turn into suspicion and infamy. So what do these stories really tell us? They reveal that the Roman Empire wasn't just about roads, aqueducts, gladiators, and conquests. It was about people, flawed, passionate, ambitious, and vulnerable people living under a system that demanded control at every turn. Their desires, scandals, and secrets shaped history just as much as their wars and politics. Think about Hadrian again. His love for Antinous built temples, created rituals, and elevated a mortal into a god. That is not just a personal romance, that is an emperor reshaping culture because of grief and devotion. Or consider Nero. His marriages weren't only shocking, they forced Roman society to confront the very boundaries of masculinity and power. Even in his cruelty, he exposed how fragile those boundaries really were. And then there's the lesson in how reputations were destroyed. Rumors of Caesar's private role, whispers about Nero and his mother, the lurid tales about Tiberius on Capri, whether true or not, they remind us that in Rome, scandal was one of the sharpest weapons. A damaged image could wound more deeply than a sword. Behind all the grandeur of temples, marble statues, and triumphal arches, the Romans were obsessed with appearances. They built an empire on conquest, yes, but they also built it on perception. For them, power wasn't just something you held, it was something you had to perform, and intimacy, strangely enough, became part of that performance. When we study the emperors of Rome, Caesar, Hadrian, Nero, Tiberius, we often focus on their politics, their military campaigns, or their reforms, but their personal lives, tangled in passion and scandal, reveal just as much about who they were and what their empire valued. They were men who carried the weight of nations, yet behind closed doors, they were vulnerable to love, lust, grief, and gossip, just like anyone else. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. Strip away the marble, the crowns, and the armies, and you find human beings driven by the same emotions, weaknesses, and contradictions that shape us today. The only difference, in Rome, those private choices could echo across centuries, shaping legacies, fueling rumors, and rewriting history itself. The Roman Empire was more than its battles and monuments, it was also a stage where power and passion collided. And the stories of its emperors remind us that history isn't just written in stone and blood. It's written in whispers, in scandal, in love, and in loss, because in the end, Rome wasn't only an empire of conquest. It was an empire of people whose hearts didn't always follow the rules of their society, and whose private lives still fascinate us thousands of years later. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next one. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.